Do you think there should be sympathy for Jonathan Majors in seeing how this has presumably manifest for him?
Before you start pointing the finger at a person, it's very good to understand where the person is coming from.
In a recent interview with The Hollywood Reporter, actor Jonathan Majors spoke up about being a survivor of child sex abuse. It's a conversation that doesn't happen often for Black men, but we're having it now, and a warning that this will be an open discussion and dialogue about sexual abuse. So, Keith, why doesn't this get discussed more often among Black men?
Yeah, well, our community in general just have a hard time with accepting that this is possible. It's about how the image of the Black male, right, in manhood, and that they're supposed to be strong. They're supposed to be the protectors of the household. And so it's really difficult for us to actually admit that we can be vulnerable, right?
And how did you get to a point where you were comfortable telling your own story as a survivor?
Yeah, well, what happened is that I got to a point where it started to destroy my life, to be perfectly honest. And I had a decision to make. I had a decision to make whether or not I wanted to be a better husband, a better person, a better friend. And I wanted to live my own narrative because there was no way that I was going to live my abuser's narrative. And oftentimes that's what happens to us, as survivors, is we start living a different narrative. And most of the time it is the one of our abusers. John says it wrote about it in the show. It's his trigger became my trigger. And when I got shot, I didn't have the energy to shoot back. And so that says so much. And as we think about intergenerational trauma, that intergenerational trauma gets passed through actions. And so, we have to do what we need to do to be able to say, okay, stop and redefine our narrative.
So, John, you have taken Keith's story into your hands by depicting this through this multimedia project with Triggered Life. What's it been like for you to interpret the story, and what artistic choices have you made in doing so?
So the first thing is really to understand the story. I'm coming from an African background, and I was looking at rituals where you try to eliminate something from the community. And so when I was listening to the story, we've been friends before this, so I didn't even know this story. I wanted to get the whole thing so that I'm doing justice to the particular work in itself. So we had many conversations about it. And then I had to sit with it and decide what's the best way to convey this message. Is it just him speaking, because he's very good at speaking, he could just stand there and tell you the story, or what can I do to bring to the story to edify the story? And I decided that it's best to have different kinds of media speaking with each other, just like different kinds of Keiths talking to each other. So that's how I came up with that.
And this sounds like art is an effective tool to talk about something that doesn't get talked about quite a bit. What are some other outlets people may go into to try to get this conversation started?
Yeah, the one thing about it is the power of art, right? We've been having Triggered Life be the starter of a conversation, but now it's gone into being a learning tool. To change how social workers, psychologists, and educators learn about Black boys and men in trauma, and be able to see our humanity first, then see how the emotional injury plays out. And that has just been the power of the project, and the fact that, John has done such a great job where people understand exactly what happens in our bodies and in our minds when we get activated, when those memories come back, and how that sometimes shapes how we show up.
And walk us through that. What is that kind of sensory experience like for a survivor?
It is emotion that comes up right away. There's anger that comes up that sometimes is uncontrollable. At times it's hard to be present in the moment because there's something from the past that's always in the way. And our hurt children, hurt little boys, girls, or however we identify, come out And those are the ones who are reacting to the moment and not us as adults.
So I mentioned at the top Jonathan Majors, the actor who recently spoke out in an interview with The Hollywood Reporter about his own childhood sexual abuse. And this was the first time he was speaking publicly since being convicted of assault and harassment of his ex-girlfriend. And the hearing you talk about, someone kind of taking on the triggers of their abuser and maybe even passing that on.
Yeah.
And also thinking about the way that we frame these conversations. Do you think there should be sympathy for Jonathan Majors in seeing how this has presumably manifest for him?
Well, it's important to know history. So it's before you start pointing the finger at a person, it's very good to understand where the person is coming from. And so there's a better dialogue after. You cannot talk about him without knowing where he came from, what happened, and where he is right now. That's a better conversation if we have the history. That's why in Triggered, we have two halves. The first half is the story, and then the second half, I'm not telling the story anymore. I am respecting the people in the room, knowing that they have history, and they have a conversation and begin to understand each other.
Right.
And if we can't do that, then we're in trouble.
Mm-hmm. What are some things that people may misunderstand, whether it's Jonathan Majors or someone who's sitting right next to them and maybe exhibiting aggressive behavior or any other type of behavior? Maybe they're very quiet. What are some things we may misunderstand about a survivor and how they might show up in the world?
Yeah, I think people judge really quickly, right? Like I like the fact that what you said, John, is understanding the whole story. Right? Just because we understand the whole story doesn't mean that we're saying that things are right. But it's important to have the dialogue, right? I would love to know, how did being a survivor affect you in relationships? Mm-hmm. And how did it possibly come into play with what happened to you, right? And with the case. Because that's actually the next part of the question that we don't necessarily get to. But what we want folks to do is be able to take a first glance, a second glance, pause, and a third glance that maybe from the behavior that folks are seeing, that this is a possibility. Because we don't think about it, we don't talk about it, and we've missed it. There's so many Black men that are walking around screaming in silence.
Mm-hmm. And to that point, I would imagine that some people aren't speaking up because of what we mentioned earlier, right? The stigma,
Right.
How weakness could be projected onto them. So how do you get past that and trying to share one story?
Yeah, I think one thing is I don't think about it as getting past it, so to speak. I think it's trying to face it and deal with it. But the hardest thing for us to do is to tell ourselves the truth before we can tell anybody else. And that's really difficult to do. Because it forces us to have to redefine our own manhood. Mm-hmm. And what exactly does that mean? And how do we then fit into the community redefining our narrative? Mm-hmm. And I think that's the way we have to try to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
I would add this too, because I also teach at a high school. Mm-hmm. And when you're teaching, you can't predict or say this is what's happening to this individual student.
Right.
But you have to be open enough to know that this is something that has to be addressed. Mm-hmm. And many times as a teacher, you have to have enough patience and find ways to talk to this student and try to figure out what's best for this student. Right. So it becomes really difficult compared to what we're talking about here because, like we're saying, they don't want to talk about it.
Right.
But they're going through this for 4 years.
Right.
What's the best thing a teacher can do at that moment is critical.
What are some questions that you might ask a student if you're worried about them?
So luckily, I've spoken to Keith, I've spoken to other people and looking at symptoms that I can see. It doesn't mean I'm going to immediately directly talk to the student about that, but slowly start to build a real relationship.
Right.
And from that, hopefully we begin to have a conversation where they feel they trust me. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then I can start having these conversations. Mm-hmm. But I can't just immediately diagnose and say,
yeah,
we need to talk about this
exactly.
right now.
Exactly. But you mentioned symptoms. Are there any kind of key ones that you would point out?
Oh, you just mentioned somebody acting up. acting up quite a number of times, and it doesn't make logical sense. You begin to notice that when you're talking about a certain thing, that's when it's happening. And so now because you experience that now, you have a better conversation with it. Or you could just dismiss it and think this kid is bad, it's just not listening, and
It could be something deeper.
Yeah, it manifests in different ways. Some kids are quiet, and so it's really paying attention to know there's something there.
Yeah.
And being aware of that is the first step.
Yeah.
And then building trust, and then, kind of go from there. Because once you know that there's something going on, then you just have to try to figure out how to make the student feel safe in a basic way. And sometimes that is more than enough because they feel seen.
Well, Keith and John, with the work that you're doing, I'm sure you're making many, many people feel seen, and we have really only scratched the surface of this extremely important conversation, but I appreciate you both being here to continue the dialogue.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.